Welcome to Quills to Clicks, the evolution of news in Meriden. We start with Native American news. Long before the Europeans came here, Native Americans were here for thousands of years. This first display is talking about wampum belts. A lot of people believe that wampum was a source of money. Actually, wampum was a form of communication. It was a way of memorializing important things like treaties, the death of someone, or other agreements that were made. The article that you're looking at is from the New York Times in 1925. A half a dozen wampum belts were discovered. These belts memorialized events such as the Confederacy that was formed by the Six Nations. Long before we had democracy, there was democracy here in New England. That was that Confederation. There are also a treaty of peace and friendship, and in it, the Six Nations were sovereign as long as the sun shone, and they were never to be disturbed. Now, why is this important? Because in 1925, we actually denied citizenship to Native American tribes based on that particular belt of treaty. Some of the other belts that you see in here are the belt of Central Council fires, and that cemented the relationship between the Confederacy and the Grand Council of 13 Fires, which represented the 13 colonies at the time of the American Revolution. Starting next to you, you will see multicolored beads. These, while not wampum, represent how wampum would have looked many, many years ago. Our friends at the Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington gave us guidance on how to construct this belt. Each one of the colored beads that you see represents 20 years. Every time there is a small white bead, that represents a century. When you get to a large white bead, that represents a millennium. If you look at the length of this belt, this represents the thousands of years that Native Americans have lived here. You would have to get all the way up to here to find the Great Pyramid of Egypt being built. As we continue down through this, we would have to get all the way to here before Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean. All the way to here when Wallingford is founded, and all the way to here until Meriden becomes a separate town. As you can see, Native Americans have a rich history in this area long before we were here. This is wampum. As you can see, it is various shades of purple and white, and it is made from the polished shells of clams and whelks. That, while strung into beads, it is usually strung together into belts. Our second display is about town criers and broadsides. Before there were newspapers, there were things called broadsides. A broadside was a single sheet of paper that was printed with the news and distributed by post riders and read locally by the town crier. The particular broadside that you are looking at on this page is called the Dunlop broadside. It was printed in Philadelphia in 1776. 200 copies were made. The copy that you see right now comes from the National Archives, and it would have been distributed throughout the 13 colonies, where it would have been recopied, because back in the day, they assumed that you would copy the news word for word to make sure that everything was correct. In each small town, there was usually a person called the town crier. The town crier would come and he would ring his bell indicating that he was going to be reading whatever the news on the broadside was. The broadside would have been nailed either to the door of an important building, such as a church or perhaps a tavern, or in very small towns, it perhaps would have been nailed directly to a tree. Because the literacy rates were not high, the town crier's job of distributing news was very important. The door that you are looking at is the door to the Andrews homestead. That door was on the house built in 1760. Although this is not the original door to the homestead, it is still more than 100 years old. Display number 3 is about the post road and the post office. So what was the post road? The post road was developed to take the news from Boston all the way to New York. Here in Meriden, the Boston Post Road in the 1700s would have run right down Colony Street 2 blocks away. The post riders were incredibly important. The post riders brought the news, and when they brought the news, they would stay in taverns, and we will talk about taverns later on. Amos White was our very first postmaster, and he was appointed by Thomas Jefferson in 1806. The post office originally was located at the corner of Broad and East Main. Joel Guy, the individual listed in this picture, was actually the first post office postmaster for the West Meriden Post Office, and he was appointed by President James Polk in 1845. So as we talk about the post, you will notice that this is a stamp, original colonial stamp, and it has Ben Franklin's picture on it. When you mailed something in the post, they did not have envelopes as they do today, but rather you would have folded up your letter, you would have melted wax, and you would have taken that wax and you would have sealed that envelope with the wax to make sure that no one had read it. This particular set here, this is based on the one used for the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The original was made by a Philadelphia silversmith in 1752, and it would have been very similar to this. Early post offices often had reward signs and other public information in them. And although this is extremely difficult to read, if you think postage is complicated today, this is the postage list for the late 1700s. Taverns, as we see in display 4, were a vital part of news. As we mentioned earlier, the post riders would have to stop on their long journey. They would stop at a local tavern, and indeed, they would share the news with the tavern keeper, who would then become news central for that moment in time. Meriden had many taverns. The earliest tavern was Jonathan Gilbert's Belcher Tavern, which was far up on North Colony Street. Later taverns, such as the ones pictured here in Meriden, served many purposes. If you look at this tavern right here, this tavern was located, as we said before, the first post office was in this tavern. It was located across the street from where the Stop and Shop is on Broad and East Main today. Number 2, this tavern here, this tavern was right where you are standing now. This tavern was taken down to make way for this building in the early 1920s. In the late 1700s, we see the rise of newspapers. We are featuring the Connecticut Courant in this display, as it is one of the oldest newspapers in the country. As a matter of fact, it is the oldest continuously published newspaper in the United States. At this moment in time, there were 2 other newspapers in Connecticut, one in New London and one in New Haven. What you see here is you actually see issue 1 of what was known then as the Connecticut Current. And Connecticut's first newspaper was in New Haven, and it was established by Ben Franklin. And he actually fired the publisher down there, and that publisher, Mr. Green, went to Hartford and would start the Connecticut Current. Printing a paper in the 1700s was a very lengthy process. They would use presses such as this. Things would have to be printed 1 page at a time. They would have to be hung up to dry, and it would take a very long time to print even a single sheet. In rural areas, the post rider would deliver that paper, which would have probably been nailed to the door of that important building. A skilled team could produce a few hundred or maybe even 1,000 copies in a day, even with this type of equipment. What I'd like you to notice is that political cartoons, even in 1787, were popular. This particular cartoon represents the 2 factions, the Federalists, who favored the new Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, with Connecticut in the middle being pulled apart by the controversy at that moment in time. It should be noted that the New Haven Gazette was a pro-British paper. It would go out of business in the Revolutionary War. What you are looking at right now are little tiny letters. All of those would have been put in a form like this. They would have had to have been loaded letter by letter to spell everything that you would see in the newspaper, and those would be inked, and those would be what was used to print the paper. In display number 6, we talk about the telephone, and people ask, why on earth is telephone news? Because in the very early days, you had telephone operators. This picture right here is a picture of the original switchboard that was here in Meriden. A telephone operator would have to know which wires to put into which holes in order to connect the various people. As such, that operator would often hear the conversations. Most of us have seen Little House on the Prairie and have seen Harriet Nelson listening in on private conversations. And so a telephone blurred that line between news and gossip. Meriden was actually the 2nd city in the United States to have telephone service. This very short list right here is all of the people who had telephones in Meriden back in 1878. The telephone operator would eventually be shortened to the word operator. There was actually a physical person right up until the 1980s who, when you dialed 0 for the operator, you got a real human being. In many smaller places, you could ask the operator to read you the news for the day, to give you the weather forecast, or to do any other small items of news. This is very different from today. There are even cases that are documented where the telephone operator would help students with their homework if they called 0. And so, operators were a very important part of passing on the news. What we see next is the telegraph, and the telegraph would have been in the local railway station. The picture that you see on the placard is the original Meriden postal train station. This particular map shows where Meriden is with the railroad and the telegraphs here in Connecticut. Meriden was midway between New Haven and Hartford and was a very important stop. The picture on the top of the man in a railway station operating the telegraph, while not taken in Meriden, would have been very typical of what this person would do. Down below, you see an old school telephone and telegraph setup where people would actually hit that key in dots and dashes of Morse code in order to send the message. Most telegraph lines followed the railway. The two pictures on the upper right represent the Meriden telephone. It was the Western Union Telegraph Office, and you will notice the children in uniform standing in front. They would have been employees of the telegraph, and they would be the ones who would run a message to somebody's house. Below, you see a bill from the Meriden Telegraph, and you will see that it was almost $4 in 1917 to send something like this. That would have been a lot of money, and telegraphs would have only been used for incredibly important news. Finally, we get to actual newspapers here in Meriden. It would be almost 100 years after the start of the Connecticut Current before the first Meriden newspaper would come about. In 1863, it was the Meriden Recorder, the one that is top center. The pictures that you see do not represent all of the early papers that we had here in Meriden, but they were all of the papers for which I could actually find a front page. You will notice that the newspapers in the 19th century did not feature pictures. They did not have bylines. With the exception of Abraham Lincoln's obituary, you barely see headlines. News stories would have been simply separated by an ellipse. 2 or 3 sentences, an ellipse, and then it would go on to the next story. Again, you will see an example in the upper left-hand corner of a political cartoon. This one comes from 1956, and it shows Fremont, who was a presidential candidate during that year. And he has all of his radical followers that include a socialist, a feminist, among other people who, at that moment in time, would have been considered very radical for the day. Probably why Fremont did not win.
Radio was a big part in my house because my father used to listen to the radio a lot. So whatever he was hearing, I was in the vicinity and was picking up. Of course, nowadays we have 24-hour news channels, but we didn't have that in radio. There were some 15-minute news roundups. CBS had at 8 o'clock in the morning a 15-minute news roundup, which I heard almost every day because when my father went to work, he left the radio on, and I never turned it off, and I was still there, so I was able to hear. But of course, nowadays, somebody could be speaking from China, and it sounds like they're in Hartford. And in those days, you got all kinds of static with reports from Rome and overseas. So radio had, kind of an influence on me almost by osmosis. There was this little girl got trapped underneath, fell into a hole. Kathy Fiscus was her name, and there was big news coverage on trying to get her out of the ground. Unfortunately, to no avail, she died.
So if you controlled the radio, what did you like to listen to?
Baseball games. I was a big Brooklyn Dodger fan. My father used to listen to Fred Allen and Jack Benny, and he was a big Bing Crosby fan like I am. And those programs, well, I might hear them, like I say, being in the vicinity of the radio. At least when I got to be about 9 or 10 years old, you had a little control of things. You were a little bit more aware of what's going on. Talking came easier to me than actually working. And Bill Hennessy, who was on Hartford Radio, he took an interest in me and gave me some encouragement and helped me a little. But there really wasn't an awful lot of formal education. It was mostly listening to lectures, just like they listen to lectures at Harvard. Well, I went to broadcasting school.
Where was this broadcast school?
It was in downtown Hartford. Later, it moved out into Bloomfield, I think it went to. But Dick Robertson was the man that ran it and owned it.
What was your first job in radio?
Well, I worked not very far from here at WMMW. I thought, boy, this is a big deal, you know, I'm on the radio. I was changing fluorescent light bulbs. They didn't teach me that in broadcasting school. I was the morning man at WMMW. They stand for Wallingford, Middletown, and Meriden, because when the station first went on the air, which was 1947, the morning was broadcast from Meriden, and in the afternoon it was broadcast from Middletown. But that ended after a year or two. Radio wasn't the most stable business to be in. New owners buy the station, they change the format, or they don't like your voice or your looks, even though it's radio. Oh, I was a dispatcher for a while at the police department. The owner of the station wanted to do away, well, like a lot of businessmen, he wanted to cut expenses as much as he could. So he didn't have a newsman. So I was doing the morning show, and I don't know if Carter White had known this or anybody at the record, but I would pick up a Meriden record on the way in, and I would paraphrase the story. It seems like most stations try to have as little news as possible because they'll lose people. Except for now public radio. For the most part, there isn't even network news anymore. There used to be CBS and NBC would have at least a 5-minute newscast on the hour, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. It seems like every station has a different niche. You know. There was a station in New York, WHN, which for a while was WMGM. MGM, the movie studio, owned it. And they had like a news, almost like today. So that's one of the big changes. When I started in radio, which was about 1969, 1970, I would never have imagined how it is today, so I would hate to try to guess what it might be in the future. It's funny, when you listen to radio, you're hearing the voice as it is normal, like you're sitting here with me, but television, the people you see are still little tiny.
Do you think that news and news reporting has significantly changed over the years?
There's more opinion now. I'm not saying it's unfair because you can give both sides of an argument. Yeah, it was Meriden, Wallingford, and in fact, the last station I worked for was the Archdiocese station, which was WJMJ, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, which wasn't quite like WMMW.
So, I mean, WMMW is still broadcasting, isn't it?
Well, yes, it's DRC uses it as a sort of a relay station because their signal was weak in Meriden. So they got the transmitter, which is out by the square. When I was at WMMW, part of the day we were on a satellite. This was back in the early 90s when I came back to the station. And sometimes the satellite wasn't working, so I would just get in my car, drive over there, and with my foot kick the just like a car, you know, and it would go on. I'm not an engineer, but it was crazy.
When I was growing up, WDRC was the station.
Oh yeah, POP and DRC had this Yeah, they had a battle as to who could have the shortest newscast because they wanted to get back to the Beatles and whoever it was.
From that time in the 90s, I remember Wallingford being in the spotlight for not recognizing Martin Luther King Day as a federal holiday. My father was very active with the local chapter of the NAACP and planning the Meriden Black Expo and other festivities that celebrated, the culture and recognized it. And so, I grew up in a household where civil rights was important. I remember I met Jesse Jackson when he came, and I was just like, why is he here?
What were kind of the rules of the house when you were growing up?
We had to watch things that we could watch together. So whether that was the Wonder Years or Growing Pains or Family Matters or A Different World, we all had to watch a show together. We eat as a family, we talk as a family, we watch TV as a family. And I was like, are we the Huxtables? I was the one who wanted to turn on the news when they came home. So by 8th grade, I was okay to stay home by myself, and the news came on at 5 o'clock. I remember watching Gayle King and, just being in awe that a woman who looked like me was, on television reading the news and doing such a great job. And so that's when I kind of got interested in it. I still had hopes that I would be a teacher. So that's what I went to UConn for originally. But while I was there, I switched my major to journalism, and I always thought back to, wow, I used to watch the news all the time. Maybe this really is what I'm supposed to be doing. So UConn was in the Final Four, and I believe it was 1990, and a reporter was on our campus, Dee Griffin, and she stopped me and she said, would you like to be interviewed for Channel 3? And I said, sure. And she asked me some questions, and I answered them, and she's like, wow, you're a really great interview. I was like, thank you. She's like, have you ever thought about journalism? If you think about it, here's my information. Call me and let me see if I can, get you interested in an internship with Channel 3. And that was a moment that really sparked everything. I switched my major maybe about 3 months later, and I called Dee Griffin, and I said, hey, this is the girl that you met at UConn, and I am interested in an internship. It was a paid internship, and I learned so much, not just writing and the particulars of, crews and assignments, but really just the charisma and what it takes to be a team member. After graduating, I took a job there. I did production, and not really what I wanted to do in the industry. I'm going to learn every role, and I did. And they even paid for me to get my master's. I wanted to be on the scene. I wanted to explain what was happening. I wanted to tell good stories. And that's important to me. The technology has changed quite a bit. Now it is, not the big cameras. Some people even shoot on their cell phones. It used to be a reporter and a photographer, a lighting person, an audio person, all together on one assignment. Now it can be just a reporter who's doing all the photography by themselves. It's also changed because now the news doesn't seem to ever stop. The news used to be from 5 to 6:30. And now it's anytime with the internet, with social media, you can get news at any point of the day. And so that's a big difference. It's being on demand for the person who's looking for information.
Do you think that network television has a future in an ever-burgeoning age of multiple social media platforms, streaming services, and other things?
I think they have a future, but I'll be honest, I'm not necessarily a fan of the way network television has transformed over the last few years. I think that's a little bit too opinionated and has been for a little while. And if it goes back to just kind of giving the news of the day, then I think more people would tune in. I think that if we give people facts, then there's hardly anything to agree or disagree on. I think that going back to the basics is never a bad thing. Everybody has a choice, but if something is your favorite, you'll use it time and time and time again. I think the same way is like for your morning news team or your television station. It's your favorite, so you're a consumer of it, you like it, you use it. If you lose people's trust, though, it is very hard to get it back.
Since you have local news for a period of time, and then they break and they go off to the national broadcast.
That's how we local stations get their affiliation and are able to broadcast to homes. It's like paying the rent, you know. We have to be able to pay for our station affiliation so that we can broadcast. They know that if they like this news team and they don't like what comes on after it, they have this special thing in their hand called a remote control that they just easily use. It is a sensitive time for television news. Stations are closing. There are layoffs happening among some of the bigger companies. We have so many threats to the business. The remote control that I mentioned is just one of them. You know, you can turn it to something else. But now there's, you know, the internet, and there's social media, and there's streaming services, and there's the network. Our threats went from Channel 8, 30, and 61 to like now 100 new threats, Yahoo News, MSN News. It's just an endless amount of people in the game.
What would your advice be to a young person who aspires to a career in news?
Definitely get a background in journalism so that you learn the basics of unbiased reporting. There are so many different avenues that you can go into, but start at just getting a foundation in journalism, because I think that's what's missing today. We have bloggers out there, we have influencers, we have the journalists who are paid to talk and like I am, but, you know, I don't give my opinion. I give, you know, the facts of the news. My local hero is Scott Haney. He took me under his wing when I started at Channel 3. He really showed me how to talk to people, you know, how to give them your best and be yourself. In Greensboro, where I worked for 18 years, there was a woman, Sandra Hughes, who was the first black television anchor in Greensboro, North Carolina. She had her own show, Sandra and Friends, and I was able to work with her, and she got it right. She understood that, you know, you are a representation not only of yourself, but of an entire community. You know, watching Gayle King, growing up as a child, I had no idea that I would be working at the same station where she worked. But if I could talk to myself, you know, back when I was 13 and 14 and 15, you know, saying like, oh, this woman is good, you know, I would tell myself like, hey, that can be you. So, television news is exciting. It's fun. If you're going to choose a career, choose one that you have fun with every single day. I love television news, but I also love people, and there's no better thing than tying them together, because I can talk about my community, I can pump everybody up, I can get people ready for their day, but I can also, you know, do the thing that I love, which is talk.
What's the hardest news story you ever covered?
9/11 was terrible, and I was working at Channel 3. They sent a crew down, and I was lucky enough to be a part of that crew. I said lucky because I was thinking that this was going to be an experience of a lifetime, which turned out to be, but not for the reasons that I wanted. It was terrifying.
I can remember, certainly when I was growing up, there were no female news reporters. I mean, it was all McNeil and Cronkite, and, you know, I mean, that was it. There weren't any women, period.
News has changed. I mean, and it really depends the market you're in.
You come from a long line of newspaper-involved people. What role did the news play at home in your house?
Well, the Record Journal was our family business for 157 years. Goes back to 1867 with a weekly newspaper, and then that was converted by my family when they bought in a partnership in 1892. So, you know, it goes back to my father's grandfather. All the time, they used to talk about editorial subjects at the dinner table. We saw the Hartford Courant and the New Haven Register. They were the main competitors. My mother and father, of course, read the New York Times too, because they were, as they still are, the bellwether for journalism.
Growing up in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of big news stories. What's the biggest news story you remember as
Yeah.
a child?
Well, locally there were a number of fires right around the buildings that where we are now, and it seemed like there were major fires on multiple occasions. So those are the biggest local stories. But of course, growing up, things were pretty quiet in the 50s. But then the Cuban Missile Crisis and JFK being murdered, those were probably the biggest stories in my childhood. My grandfather, who was publisher at the time, wanted the lead pots turned off to save money after the Friday night edition for Saturday morning, and because there was no Sunday edition. So the pots were off for almost 48 hours. But on Sunday morning, my father would go down and light the pots, and I remember him crawling underneath, and he would bring me down. I must have been 5 or 6 years old at that time. And I can remember that was a regular Sunday thing. That melted the lead so you could reuse the lead, and also you have to put new lead in also to make the linotype. They call it a bank boy, where they make the corrections, and you change the linotype to put in the correct. So you have to read upside down, because it's the process is you make these blocks of type, and then there's a kind of hard plastic or cardboard, I guess, stereotype that would have that. So that imprint would be on a positive side. Then you make a lead plate that is going to go on the press, that is a reverse again, and then when it prints on the paper, it comes out positive again. So it's a back and forth 4 steps. My parents cast a big shadow, so I wanted to go out on my own, see if I wanted to be in the family business. So it wasn't just news, that was our product, but local advertising was very important for the local business community. We had over 1,000 youth carriers at one time, when we had the Record and the Journal, the morning and afternoon paper. That was kids under 15. When I went to college, I was an English major. I took some journalism courses, and because it was a family business, it was important for me to consider.
Did you ever at any point consider any other career, or was this sort of baked in the cake once you went to work?
I enjoyed what I did in California, and the original plan was to go there for a couple of years and learn the business. I wanted to learn a part of the business that my parents weren't as familiar with. So if I did come back here, I would have a strength of my own. I almost stayed. I stayed a lot longer than I would have.
How does a story make it to Above the Fold?
A lot of suggestions come from people in the community, but there's a process. There's professional journalists, even in a small newspaper our size. One time we had 50 people in the news department, and only 3 or 4 of them are in the opinion area.
Could you share with us what some of those changes have been that you have seen?
First, if you look at ownership, and the ownership, when I first came back from California in '78, I think there was only one newspaper in the state that was not owned by a local family. The Hartford Courant was just selling to the Times Mirror. And then, during the 80s, there were quite a few sales. There were, at the time, about 1,750 daily newspapers. Now there are 1,200 daily newspapers. In the time when there were 1,750, probably 3/4 of them were privately owned. Now there's less than 300 of those 1,200 that are actually less than that, probably 200 now. So the ownership is the first area I think that probably changed significantly as it evolved. There became fewer and fewer daily newspapers and fewer weekly newspapers. 9, we bought several weekly newspapers, and we're expanding our market. And that was a way to grow our revenue and to have some synergy and to survive. But over time, of course, that changed too. And the disruptive forces were the internet when that started to take over some of our business, classified advertising. The big revenue parts of classified started to erode through the internet with housing and automotive, which found other competitive ways to advertise. The evolution in the news, the internet, as it went along, Google and later Facebook started to scrape our news, which, we paid the reporters, and they got the news without remuneration for the business. And that's still the case today, and that's really been, a huge disruption. And then, of course, the recession of 2008, 2009 really was a double punch there to our business. And then, COVID didn't help. Another 10 years later, after the recession in 2008 and 9, there was a lot of news advertising that didn't come back. If you go back from the beginning, and when I started, there were big department stores downtown. We had Boynton, Style Tex, and sporting goods stores, local sports. Those all changed. We started to outsource in 2009. That was a result of the recession, and at that point, it became obvious that newspapers either had to print other newspapers to be viable or have someone else print you. And we decided for us, the size paper that we were, the best option was to outsource. And the Record Journal is still printed in Springfield. Now there's only a couple of printers in Connecticut. So that's how the production kind of sifted down. And then, of course, people started reading the newspaper on the internet. We started our own website in 2000. So it was tough to get youth carriers then too, because in the early 2000s, people didn't want their kids out at 4 or 5 in the morning any longer. It was kind of the difference between growing up as a kid in the 50s and growing up in the 2000s. It was a microcosm of that because, things were a little more dangerous. We ended up going to the mail in 2023, almost a year before we sold, because the service that we were getting from the carrier, the adult carriers with the current had deteriorated, and people wanted better service. A lot of the best journalists are print journalists who maybe you see on TV too. There's a lot of crossover now. Journalism is so important for a democracy. To get on social media is maybe news that has a lot of opinion in it. There's so much fact-checking that's necessary that, I think the really good newspapers will survive. There are people who like to read, but it certainly has changed dramatically. I like to read the newspaper on an iPad. Our highest circulation was in the mid to late 90s, almost 30,000 paid circulation. So that quickly evolved down to, I'm not sure what the number is right now, but 10 or 20%. Like there's a lot of news deserts where there's no local news produced, and that's a big concern. In your hometown, you need to know what's going on, and in government, you need to know what is going on with your high school. I guess it needs to be important to enough people to make it sustainable, but there certainly is a void there that is partially being altered or filled. It used to concern me when the news media newspapers were lumped into the news media because, often people, when you really drill down into it, they're talking about TV news, or in the internet news too more recently. I think they're sometimes different audiences and different purposes and different profit models. So, I think there is a future for all three.
As we move into the 20th century, we now see the modern rise of newspapers. You will see that in these front pages, there are photos, there are headlines, there are bylines. And this is the beginning of what would become the Meriden Record Journal. You will notice that all of the papers that are listed here are some variation on the name: Meriden Record, Meriden Journal, the Morning Record, the Journal, the Morning Record and Journal. And it isn't until far later that we actually get the Record Journal. As you heard Elliot White speak in his interview, at one time there were over 1,700 family-owned newspapers in the state of Connecticut, and that number now is just over 200. He also described to you the process of making the newspaper. These items that you see here represent part of that four-step process in creating a newspaper, where it would be backwards, then forwards, then backwards, and finally printed for the final time using something like this. The linotype, which started in 1930, actually held full lines of text and was typed in rather than set individually. You will also notice in the 20th century that we have the start of the funny papers, and we continue to have political cartoons of every ilk. You see the picture of the newspaper girl circa 1960, who would have had a bag like that, and she would have been in business for herself, delivering the newspaper on her route, collecting the money, then going down to the Record Journal to turn her money in and to make her profit. Our next important source of news is radio. As you heard Phil Callan say, here, working locally at WMMW, Meriden, Middletown, and Wallingford, he often had to run across the street, buy a newspaper, and read the news himself to get the news out on radio. Some of the artifacts that you see here are old-fashioned microphones. To your left, where it says WDRC, that would be a mobile microphone that someone might take out into the field. Radios originally were the size of this entire black-coated cabinet, and you would sit at home with your parents looking at the radio. Radios would take vacuum tubes this large. Eventually, everything would shrink down so that radios would get smaller and smaller. Edwin Armstrong, actually, who the inventor of FM radio, put his mast up here locally in Meriden. This is a picture of the original 90-foot mast, which actually still stands today and is still used by WDRC as a repeater station. Early radio was a great source of both entertainment and of news. You would have listened to Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats to hear the latest news during World War II.
First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning round. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is fully sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen. In other words, the total amount of all the currency in the country is only a comparatively small proportion of the total deposits in all the banks of the country.
For those of you who are listening carefully and have watched It's a Wonderful Life, you can almost hear the echo of George Bailey saying, "But Joe, your money's not in the bank. It's in his house, and his house, and his house." These fireside chats were an important news phenomenon where the president came on weekly to speak to the American public over radio waves. From the 1910s to the 1960s, newsreels would become an incredibly important way of communicating the news. Here in Meriden, we had several local theaters. These theaters, movies changed every single Friday. It cost in 1910 roughly 7 cents to go to a movie. And at the beginning of every movie, there would be a 10 to 15 minute newsreel. People would come to the movies, they would hear the news, they would be entertained, and they would come back again next week. Making a movie of 15 minutes long on a weekly basis became the main business of specific companies like Movietone News. All they did was make these short documentaries, and the film would actually have to be hand-delivered to movie theaters all over the United States. Think of the monumental task that would have been in 1920, before automobiles were all that common, of getting a brand new movie out every single week. An example can be seen here.
Hawaii's bright Sunday becomes a black Sunday. High overhead, Jap raiders are on the loose. Without warning, they circle Pearl Harbor and the city of Honolulu. A surprise attack born of infamy. Sirens reach the alarm too late. Already the yellow men have unloosed their bombs. Planes sweep the Waikiki district. Sky rains death and destruction. Caught unawares on this fateful Sunday morning, Americans quickly and calmly evacuate the danger districts. Swiftly, the United States Air Force gets underway for interception, for revenge. Sky fills with planes. Japan has struck. America now strikes back. There is no panic. Great fires are kept well under control. Volunteer defense units join the regulars as incendiary bombs demolish a vast area of home.
As we said, these would usually last about 15 minutes and would carry the important news of the day. Following radio and the advent of movies, the golden age of television and the small screen would come of age in the 1940s. Edward R. Murrow, on your left as you look at this, was one of the few personalities to be able to make the switch from radio to TV, and he was best known for saying good night and good luck on CBS after his newscast. As you look at this display, the golden age of television was actually an age of black and white TV. There were three major networks. They were ABC, NBC, and CBS. The people who you have seen here, Chet Huntley and David Brinkley on NBC, Walter Cronkite on CBS, Robert McNeil and Jim Lehrer on PBS, these are the famous golden age of television. This was called an appointment with the news. You would turn the ones on that you appreciated every night at a certain time, usually around 6:30. The first newscasts were only 15 minutes long. They later expanded to 30 minutes, but your appointment with the news every night was something that would happen. By the 1980s, we had color television, but we still have important news anchors. Tom Brokaw on NBC, Peter Jennings on ABC, and Dan Rather on CBS all had 20, 30, and 40-year-old careers on one station, giving you the news as they saw it. Walter Cronkite, most famous for, and that's the way it is. One of the questions I get asked is, who said good night and good news? Well, folks, that was Ted Baxter on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and he was not a real newscaster. It does, however, show the prevalence of how important the news was to us in the age of television. Television becomes incredibly important in the 1960 presidential election. It was the first televised debate. The pictures you see at the bottom are the respective Kennedy and Nixon campaign headquarters here in Meriden.
In the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln said the question was whether this nation could exist, half slave or half free. In the election of 1960, and with the world around us, the question is whether the world will exist, half slave or half free, whether it will move in the direction of freedom, in the direction of the road that we are taking, or whether it will move in the direction of slavery. I think it will depend in great measure upon what we do here in the United States, on the kind of society that we build, on the kind of strength that we maintain. We discussed tonight domestic issues, but I would not want that to be any implication to be given that this does not involve directly our struggle with Mr. Khrushchev for survival. Mr. Khrushchev is in New York, and he maintains the communist offensive throughout the world because of the productive power of the Soviet Union itself.
Looking then to this problem of how the United States should move ahead and where the United States is moving, I think it is well that we take the advice of a very famous campaigner. Let's look at the record. Is the United States standing still? Is it true that this administration that Senator Kennedy has charged has been an administration of retreat, of defeat, of stagnation? Is it true that as far as this country is concerned, in the field of electric power, in all of the fields that you have mentioned, we have not been moving ahead?
It is of note that in this debate, those people who listened to the debate on radio felt that Mr. Nixon, the vice president under Eisenhower, had clearly won the debate. Those people who watched on television thought that the young, charismatic senator from Massachusetts had won the debate, and thus would begin the huge influence that TV would have on American politics. As we move past the golden age of television into the 80s to 2000, television news would transform from a nightly appointment to a 24/7 cycle. CNN, cable news network, was started in 1980 by Ted Turner. His critics called it the chicken noodle network, as they thought that 24-hour news had no future. In point of fact, television wasn't on the air 24 hours a day. Generally speaking, there would be a test pattern after 11 o'clock, and it wouldn't be until 5 or 6 in the morning when broadcasting started again. Today, there are 79 24-hour news networks. Originally, someone in the newspaper or in the television studio would get their news through one of the many machines that were here. The monotype, circa 1930 to 1970, was a machine that worked somewhat like a typewriter in that the news would come out and it would be printed on what would look like a typewritten sheet of paper. Typewriters had been around for a very long time. But when they made it to the newsroom floor, all of a sudden, women had entree into the newsroom because they were considered to be better typists. Many of you don't know where some of the common terms that you use in word processing today come from. Back in the day, the reporter would be sitting at his typewriter. He would have a paste pot. He would have a sheet of paper. He would type up his story, he would cut it out, and he would paste it onto the paper where it would go. And that, my friends, is why you use copy and paste when you are using a word processor today. Tracy McCain, who is currently on WFSB as a newscaster, talk to you about how she became started in journalism and what she feels is now the transfer of news from something that used to be straight fact into something that has now become more editorialized. Back in the early days, you would have also used a fax machine where you could actually use the telephone wire to print a picture, not just the written word, which was a huge thing. Television, you used to have to use the TV guide. You would look up the day, you would look up the time, and you would find out what was playing on TV. Old school TVs were very, very large. They were an actual piece of furniture. It wouldn't be until much later that you got these tabletop sets. These are very wide, very clunky, very big. You then moved to flat screen televisions, And today, it is not at all unusual to see a 60-inch diagonal screen in someone's home. It should be noted that there were two very important laws that happened. In 1987, the Fairness Doctrine allowed for more opinion to be used in the news, and the Telecommunications Act of 1986 allowed corporations, big corporations, to buy up television news in the same way that Hearst and Pulitzer bought out newspapers earlier on. We finally arrive at modern news, the internet and social media. Over here on the right, what we find is that back in 1996 at the Chicago Convention, it was termed that newfangled thing where somebody actually used the internet on the convention floor in a demonstration. You also note that I've shown you pictures of what computers at that moment in time might have looked like. The precursor to YouTube was a site called Share Your World, which was founded in 1997. And it allowed users to upload videos in different file formats. Blogs, the first known one was from a North Carolina paper, the Charlotte Observer, in 1998. Google News, believe it or not, is almost a quarter of a century old. If you will recall Elliot White's talk, he had said that the advent of news like this made it very difficult for newspapers because Google and others like them would simply scrape the news, and it cost them nothing to get those stories, whereas the newspaper had to pay reporters, pay for a building, pay to have things printed, and these guys were just taking it all for nothing. Over here in 2004, and you will notice it says the Facebook, that Mark Zuckerberg would start this at Harvard University simply as a way for college kids to get to know each other better. We have now seen Facebook morph into something where there is more news posted, whether it is true or false, almost, than personal posts. 2006, you see the rise of Twitter, and in 2017, TikTok is launched outside of China, and TikTok remains the most important news source for most people under 25. The internet is gradually replacing traditional media. 83.7% of people now get their news from the internet. This is one of my favorite infographics, and I wish I could put this up in a banner. As you look from left to right, it shows you whether a particular news outlet is left-leaning or right-leaning, and top to bottom, it's the actual veracity of the news, where at the bottom part, that might be news that has no basis in fact, all the way up to the top quadrant, and you'll notice no one is up there, of news that is incredibly well researched. You can see that according to this, in the middle and near the top, there are actually very few news outlets. What we like to do is we like to encourage people to use something like Ground News or allsides.com, which actually look at all the news stories that are the same, they compare them, and they will tell you, left-leaning report it like this, right-leaning report it like that, those in the middle report it like this. Always check your news. We do find that the younger you are, the most likely you are to get your news from some sort of handheld device. And they note that traditional news was one to many. Walter Cronkite gets on and he talks to an audience of millions, whereas social media allows people to post something and many people can be part of the conversation or create the stories. Traditional media was about gathering and disseminating news, whereas social media is where people come to interact with the news and to give their opinion on the news. The speed, obviously traditional media is slower to respond. I post something on the internet, it is instant. Traditional news media costs a lot. Social media, have cell phone, can be a reporter. We hope that you've enjoyed this evolution of news, and we invite you to come to our museum and see our current exhibits.